Happy Wednesday! You're listening to Mama Murdered a Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're diving super deep into part 2 of Casey and Caylee Anthony. And this week, I want to go through the timeline of events leading up to when 3-year-old Caylee was last seen alive. So we're looking at some information that was found during the investigation. And I'm just going to try to piece it all together for you so that it makes sense, because a lot of this stuff we found out during trial. So I'm jumping ahead to trial to be able to jump backwards to tell you the timeline. So if you're like me, you're going to need a refresher or like a little recap of last week's episode to remember like what happened, where we were, where we left off. So without further ado, let's get it. Also, really sorry this episode's so late. I'm doing my best, guys. I'm doing my best. So last week we talked about Casey faking her whole ass graduation, not telling anyone that she hadn't actually graduated, and yet still being thrown this huge graduation ceremony by her parents. And at this ceremony, Casey collected gifts and money from friends and family members who genuinely thought that Casey had graduated from high school. But Casey's parents knew that she didn't have the grades or the credits or whatever to be able to graduate, yet they still showed up to the graduation with Casey's grandparents in tow. Then Casey got pregnant, and yet again, she just lied to everyone about being pregnant, eventually telling everybody that she was pregnant, but she waited until she was already 8 months along. Casey would then refuse to tell anybody who Caylee's dad was, and still to this day, we don't know who Caylee's dad is. So that's fun. And then we wrapped up last week's episode by talking about how Casey lied to everyone for years about having a job. Do you see a pattern of lying going on here yet? Yeah, me too. So even though Casey didn't actually have a job, she was still getting family members and friends and even her ex-boyfriend to babysit little Caylee while Casey was supposedly at work at Universal Studios in Orlando, Florida. And that's where we wrapped for last week. So we're going to jump into this week. I'm not sure what's going on with my voice. Maybe it's because I just woke up super early to record. I'm not sure. Just work with me. And I don't know if Casey was just like going tanning or laying out by the pool, or if she was just driving around listening to music. Like, I cannot figure out what she was doing while she had all these different people babysitting Caylee while she was supposedly at work. But later, after Caylee was reported missing, we do see a lot of like bar hopping and club pictures of Casey during the 31 days that Caylee had been missing before anyone found out that Caylee was actually missing. And that last sentence will make more sense as we get further along, I swear. I'm trying to work off of the assumption that not everybody knows this case. Like, I don't want to just tell you pieces and assume that you know the rest. Now, Caylee's supposed dad and Casey's on-again, off-again boyfriend Jesse Grund would even babysit Caylee from time to time. We know Jesse wasn't actually Caylee's dad, but just roll with it. Jesse's parents would watch her, and he and Casey were even engaged at one point before Casey and Jesse broke up. And Casey broke up with Jesse because she felt like Jesse loved Caylee more than he loved her, which is so weird to me. Because for the first, 8 or 9 months of Caylee's life, Jesse was acting as if he were Caylee's dad, even though the math wasn't mathing about the time of conception and the time of birth. He still stepped up, and he still did the dad thing anyways. Jesse had even gone so far as to send in his DNA and Caylee's DNA right after Caylee was born, because he knew that the timeline of Caylee's birth wasn't adding up medically. But the paternity test was going to take 6 weeks for the results to come in. And by the time those 6 weeks were up and Maury came out to say, Jesse, you are not the father of little Caylee. Just kidding. There was no Maury. But in my head, Maury was there. So after the 6 weeks, while Jesse was waiting on this paternity test to come in, he had completely fallen in love with Caylee and the idea of being her dad. Jesse had even talked to people around him about adopting Caylee to make things legal. And all this to say that Jesse was completely smitten with Caylee, and he was just doing what he thought was best, even if he wasn't her biological dad. But eventually, Casey was ready to move on, and Jesse and Casey broke up, and Casey told Jesse that he wouldn't be able to be a part of Caylee's life anymore as her dad. that he would be known to Caylee as just one of Mommy's friends, which is so messed up. He knew that Caylee wasn't his from the jump, and he still stepped up and had stepped up since day one. And now Casey just decides to move on, and he wasn't going to be able to act like her dad anymore. You would think as a parent you would want as many people as possible to love your kid and to be there for your kid. And I honestly feel like if Jesse had a say-so in the matter, that he would have stepped in Caylee's life and acted as her dad even after Casey and Jesse broke up. Like, I really feel like Jesse would have been at Caylee's graduation. He would have helped her move into her college dorm if she would have been able to live that long. And Casey just shut both of those things down. She shut down letting Caylee have a man who was happy and willing to step up and be her dad, even though he knew he wasn't. And then she shut down Caylee having the opportunity to graduate and grow up and be a productive, contributing member of society. Casey took all of those things away. And like I said, you would think that you would want as many people as possible to love your kid and to be there for your kid. But no, not Casey. Not Casey. And then when Caylee was around the age of 2 or so, Casey started telling people that Caylee's real dad had died in a car accident. And she probably did this so that no one would be able to ask her about who her baby daddy was anymore. But in my opinion, because an accidental death is like a touchy subject to bring up in any case. So no one would want to make her relive this awful tragedy of losing her baby daddy and bring up this accidental death, by a car accident. So in my opinion, you can have your own opinion, but in my opinion, she likely made this car accident story up because she didn't actually know who Caylee's dad was. But I may be thinking about it this way just because I hate Casey Anthony so much. So, don't listen to me. And I normally try to stay pretty unbiased when I tell y'all these cases. But in this case, I definitely think Casey was responsible for what happened to Caylee. And even if she isn't the one who actually murdered little Caylee, then she, at the very least, knows who did. And she's been helping them cover it up for this long. So either way, I still hate her guts. Now, while we're on the subject of Caylee turning 2, it was at Kaylee's second birthday party when all of Casey and Kaylee's friends and family, they all gathered to try to help set up for Kaylee's second birthday party. Something that typically friends and family help with. And Casey left to pick up the cake, ice cream, decorations, party supplies, streamers, what have you. And when she returned, it didn't take Casey's grandma Shirley very long to notice that her checkbook was missing. I'm sorry, not her check. There was a check missing out of her checkbook, but her checkbook also wasn't balanced. So Grandma Shirley confronted Cindy about the fact that she thought Casey had stolen the money from her by writing checks that no one gave her permission to write. And inevitably, we find out that this check was what paid for Kaylee's cake, ice cream, and party supplies. Even though Casey was telling people that she'd also gotten a second job at the Sports Authority store, which is just a store that's like a huge sporting goods thing, it's similar to Dick's Sporting Goods or something like that. And this second fake job would give Casey even more alone time, while she guilt-tripped everybody around her into babysitting and taking care of Caylee. But Casey wasn't as good at hiding this second job as she had been her first job, because eventually she would be called out for not actually having this second job. But nobody had put it together that Casey wasn't actually working at Universal Studios anymore either. So a friend of Casey's was babysitting Caylee, and she was trying to get in touch with Casey, but when Casey didn't answer, Casey's friend called the Sports Authority store and asked to speak with Casey Anthony. Told him that it was in regards to her daughter Caylee and, she needed to speak with her. This is when Casey's friend was informed that no one by that name was working that day and that no one by that name had ever worked in this Sports Authority store. So Casey's friend did call Casey out on this lie. And I'm not even sure what kind of excuses Casey gave her friend, but I'm sure she lied her way out of it. I'm sure about that much. There was another time when Casey's dad, George, showed up at the Sports Authority store to surprise Casey and, take her out for lunch. But that's when George was also informed that a Casey Anthony did not work in this store and that she'd never had a job at that store before. And when Casey's mom, Cindy, found out about this, she kind of let Casey explain her lies away. And of course, Cindy just blindly believed Casey's every word like she always does. And this will be another running theme in this case where Cindy will believe that the grass is orange if that's what Casey tells her. It's a little bit ridiculous if I'm being honest, but what can you say? But when I say Cindy will believe damn near anything Casey says, I mean that in the most literal way possible. Casey's dad, George, had started taking like $30 or $40 a week out of his check, even though he and Cindy were always drowning in debt and always having money problems. George was still taking $30 or $40 a week out of his check, and he was putting the money into a savings account for Caylee. Once Casey found out about this savings account, though, she cleaned it completely out. She left only $5 in the account, which was the minimum amount that could be kept in the account to keep the account open. And when George found out, Casey made up some, elaborate story, and Cindy just went right along with it and just told George, let's just drop the situation and forget about it. I'm sorry, what? Casey just stole from everyone around her, though, all the time. Casey took money from her grandma Shirley another time. This time, the money that Casey stole was the money that her grandma Shirley had put up to be able to pay for Casey's grandpa to be able to put into a nursing home or an assisted living facility, somewhere where he could actually be taken care of the way he needed to be. Casey took that money too. And while we're on money that Casey stole, there's also people that say that Casey would often empty Caylee's piggy bank and leave a few small coins in it so that Caylee would still think she had lots of money in her piggy bank, because a penny worth 1 cent to a 2-year-old might as well be a $100 bill. And who does this? Who steals money from their 2-year-old child for any reason? But Casey's a different breed, though, and I don't know how I just got on this long rampage about money that Casey's stolen from different people, but here we are. So we're going to jump forward a little bit here because Casey started telling people in casual conversation about a nanny that she'd hired to babysit Caylee. This nanny would be referred to as Zany the Nanny and was actually a woman by the name of Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez. And Zany the Nanny was supposedly a nanny to one of Casey's ex-boyfriend's kids, and Casey had just started telling people that Zany the Nanny was also going to start keeping Caylee while Casey was at her fake jobs that she didn't have. And Zany the Nanny started coming up a good bit of time before Caylee went missing or before her disappearance was known to law enforcement, which screams premeditation to me. But what do I know? I just host a tiny podcast in my tiny she shed studio in my tiny backyard. And this won't be the last time that we hear about Casey stealing from people around her. But now we're going to jump into the month that we know Caylee was missing, and then the month after, in between all of that good jazz. So we're in 2008 in June. On June 9th, Casey texted a friend telling her that Caylee had used the big girl potty that day, and Casey was basically just telling her friend, how proud she was of Caylee, and this was only about a week or so before Caylee was last seen alive. So this seems like a pretty normal mom thing to me. When your kid is in the midst of potty training, moms are usually so excited that they'll tell anybody who will listen when their kid uses the big girl potty or the big kid potty, for the first few weeks when they're getting the hang of potty training. And then 2 days later, on June 11th, Casey was supposed to meet up with some friends at a nightclub, but she ended up bailing on her plans to hit the nightclub with her friends. She told them that she wouldn't be able to go because she was going to end up having to go to work. But can we all just do the biggest eye roll together over the fact that Casey doesn't actually have a job? And she hasn't had a job since before Caylee was born. Caylee was born in August of 2005. We're in June of 2008 in the timeline right now. So she's been lying to everybody about having a job for roughly 3 years at this point. Now, the same night that Casey told a friend that she wouldn't be able to go out with them because she was working, Casey also changed her relationship status on Facebook, MySpace, and, whatever social media accounts she had. She changed this relationship status to in a relationship with her most current boyfriend at the time, Tony Lazzaro. So Jesse's out the door and not allowed to see Caylee anymore, but I'd be willing to bet that her boyfriend Tony will get to be a part of Caylee's life almost daily. And I'm assuming that things must have been getting pretty serious for Casey because she changed her Facebook status to in a relationship. She's making it Facebook official, and we all know that that means they're basically engaged now because that's how Facebook official works, you know? I wish you could hear my eyes rolling. On June 12th, Casey and Caylee went to see Casey's new boo, Tony, and they were helping him hand out flyers for a club that he was promoting, and afterwards, Casey, Caylee, and Tony all went out to lunch together to the Cheesecake Factory. Afterwards, Casey met up with another friend for this friend and Caylee to have a play date together. Lord, I'm getting tongue-tied today. After the play date, Casey and Caylee went home as usual. At 11:15 that same night, there were some searches made on the computer in the Anthony house that will raise eyebrows later. So these searches were for the name Zenaida Fernandez Gonzalez, age 25, in Jacksonville, Florida. Now, we don't actually know who made this search for this name, age, and city. What we do know is that this is the same name of the Zanny the Nanny that would often watch Caylee for Casey while Casey went to her fake jobs. And if by chance you don't know anything about this case already, then just keep that name, age, and city that was searched in the back of your mind because it will definitely come up later. And then just store the little nugget that the search was done just a few days before 3-year-old Caylee was last seen alive. Keep that tucked away in your memory bank for later also. It'll also be important. So, jumping forward another 2 days later on June 13th, 2008, Casey had made plans to go help a friend with something, but when it got time to go, Casey told her friend that she wasn't going to be able to go help her, that she was sorry, but that Casey's dad, George, was in the hospital and he'd just had a stroke. Which is hella weird, especially considering the fact that George did not, in fact, have a stroke. So why would she even say that? Like, the next time that Casey's friend is over to her house where she lives with Cindy and George, and if this friend by chance happens to see George or run into him somewhere, like, I guess Casey just thought this friend wasn't going to ask George how he was after he had a whole-ass fake stroke. Like, she really didn't think this lie through. She could have said, like, hey, I can't help you today, I don't have a sitter. Or, hey, can we reschedule, I have a headache. She could have said any number of things that wouldn't have been such a dramatic lie. But like I mentioned before, Casey loves her lies. And now's probably a good time to mention that, okay, we know Casey kicked Jesse to the curb. She's Facebook officially dating Tony Lazzaro. And Tony works as like a club promoter or an event planner or something of that nature. Something to do with clubs and planning shit, I don't know. But he also managed the shot girls at clubs. And for anybody who doesn't know, a shot girl is just the girl that walks around the nightclubs with like trays full of shots and sells them to the people dancing, standing around talking, whatever. They dress really cute and they make a killing. So a few days after Casey's dad, George, had his non-existent stroke, it was actually Father's Day on June 15th. And Casey was at home, but Casey's mom, Cindy, and Caylee had been out visiting with Cindy's dad and Kaylee's great-grandpa for the most part of the day, along with some other family members. And there's a video from this visit with Caylee and her great-grandpa that I'll try to post on social media if I can figure out how to save it and then repost it. But it's a video of Caylee being snuggled up on her great-grandpa's lap while he sings "You Are My Sunshine" to her. And it will legitimately break your heart watching it, especially at the end when he says, "Please don't take my sunshine away," because he was just singing this song to her. He had no idea that the very next day would be the last time that anybody saw little Caylee alive. It's just one of those things that is really sad, and it only seems more sad in hindsight once you have some context to go along with it. And whatever was said during this visit had Cindy heated enough that she was ready to kick Casey out of her house, and it had Cindy pissed off enough to be ready to go to war with Casey to get custody of Caylee. Cindy told Casey that she was an unfit mother, and there were eyewitness accounts that all say that Cindy and Casey were fighting so bad that Cindy actually grabbed Casey around the neck and tried to choke her. And it said that this argument and fight happened because Cindy had finally learned that Casey didn't actually have a job, much less 2 jobs. And Cindy had also learned that she had been lying and getting people to keep Caylee for almost 3 years. And I'm going to be assuming here, but I'm assuming that Casey probably tried to lie her way out of this already huge lie that she'd been spinning about going to work and needing a sitter. Because according to the people that were there or heard or witnessed this, Cindy brought out all kinds of pictures of Casey out partying in the nightclubs, throwing up in toilets, and all of these pictures and shit were taken and posted on Casey's social media accounts on days that Casey had told everybody that she needed a sitter for Caylee so that she could go to work. And why Casey was dumb enough to post these on social media, knowing that everybody thought she was at work, is beyond me. I have no idea. So this was so clearly Casey getting caught in this lie about having a job and asking everyone to babysit Caylee for years now. But I would even be willing to go so far as to say that Cindy and George probably missed more than a handful of days at their real jobs because Casey supposedly didn't have a sitter. And I would be assuming that Cindy and George probably called out and missed days in order to help Casey keep Caylee. So we already know that the entire Anthony family will lie for each other and they'll all take their actual truths to their grave. So every single person in the Anthony family says that this fight never happened. That all of these people who claim to have seen the fight are either wrong or mistaken or lying or whatever. But none of these eyewitnesses from the night of the knockdown drag-out fight between Cindy and Casey have any reason to lie about what happened. They don't have a dog in this fight. But the entire Anthony family has a pretty damn good reason to lie, especially considering Caylee was last seen alive the very next day. And even the Anthony's neighbors reported hearing the argument, so I'm pretty sure the fight did actually happen. And this alleged fight between Casey and Cindy happened on June 15th, kind of later on in the evening. And like I said, this is only important because it was the very next day, on June 16th, that would be the last day that anybody saw 3-year-old Caylee alive. And the fight, according to everybody who was there or heard it or witnessed it, besides the Anthony family, of course, all say that supposedly the fight happened because, like I said, Cindy had finally found out that Casey had been leaving her daughter Caylee with a bunch of different babysitters while she went out and partied and drank with her friends, even though Casey had been telling all of these different people that she needed a sitter to be able to go into work. And how it took Cindy almost 3 years to figure out that Casey didn't actually have any job, whether it be at Universal Studios or at the Sports Authority, is beyond me. So already, Cindy called Casey out on not having a job and not going to work, and Cindy told Casey that she would have to find somewhere else to live, but that Caylee would be staying with her and George. And I feel like that's really not up to Cindy and George, honestly. I mean, as bad as I think about Casey, Caylee was Casey's daughter, not Cindy and George's daughter. And, I mean, they're just the grandparents to Caylee. That I don't think they would legally be able to keep Caylee away from Casey, from my understanding, unless they were able to prove her unfit. But nonetheless, that was the fight between Casey and Cindy, and according to everyone else that night, it did happen. And everybody in the Anthony family still claims that this fight, was non-existent. Like a completely normal day, the fight never happened. So now we're getting into the meat and potatoes of this case, because cell phone records from that night on June 15th and leading up into June 16th show that Casey was up pretty late, either talking or texting with her new boo, Tony. And it shows that she was up and on the phone with him in one way or another until after 3 a.m. on the morning of June 16th. They'd even had a phone call that was more than an hour long at one point, but he says that they were just talking about normal relationship stuff during these calls and texts. So that night, Caylee and Casey had slept in the bed together in Casey's bed. And a little later on that morning, on June 16th, Caylee woke up at around 7:30, and it was just shortly before Cindy was about to leave for work. So Kaylee's awake, and George was also up and awake and moving, and Casey was still in bed. So George made Caylee some breakfast, and he put on the TV. He put on something that Caylee would watch until Casey woke up and went into the living room or the kitchen area where Caylee and George were. But Casey wasn't actually sleeping in, and we know this because we know that Casey's computer shows that she was actually up already and awake before she came out of her room to join Caylee and George in the family room area that morning. Casey's computer records show that she'd been up between 7:56 and 8:06 that morning, chatting online with a friend. There were also a few different searches made on her computer as well. And it looks like she was looking up things that would help her boyfriend Tony promote his club, like shot girl outfits, things like that. Because what we know now is that Casey was kind of helping Tony with his club promotions and events and stuff, but she wasn't actually on the payroll. So, yay for free labor, I guess. And according to Casey's dad, George, the last time that he saw both Casey and his granddaughter Caylee together was on June 16th at 12:50 p.m. And as unreliable as human memories are, and as unreliable as eyewitnesses can be, George says that he remembers the time so well because he was watching the Food Network show Diners, Drive-Ins, and Dives. And if you watch something religiously, then it would be a good way to know a roundabout time frame for when something happened. Like, if you know what time the show stops and starts, you're at least within the right hourly time frame. So this is how George says that he remembered the time so well, because the show was almost over when Caylee and Casey left the house that day. And he remembered it being the 16th because that was the last time that he saw Caylee for over a month. So George says that the show that he was watching was on a commercial break when Caylee came over to him to tell him bye. And when George asked where they were going, 3-year-old Caylee told him that her and Casey were leaving and that they were going to see Zany the nanny. And remember, Zany the nanny is somebody that would often watch Caylee while Casey pretended to go to work. And George is sure of the time and even claims to remember exactly what Caylee was wearing when she left the house that day with Casey. George says that Caylee was wearing a pink shirt with jean shorts with sandals and socks, and that she was rocking her huge white sunglasses with a small white backpack that was in the shape of a monkey, and that Casey was carrying her regular bag that she normally took with her to her imaginary job every day. But there's a slight mishap with this time frame, though, which I'll get to later. Casey tells George that if she ends up working late and if Caylee's already asleep when she gets off, that Caylee will probably just spend the night at Zany's house to make it easier. And George is like, okay, which I kind of find weird because Cindy and George had never met Zany the nanny before. And as overprotective as they were about Caylee, I just think it's a little bit weird, especially considering the fact that Cindy and George both like to pretend that Caylee was their daughter and not Casey's, but that they never asked to meet the nanny that would be keeping Caylee all the time. As Cardi B would say, that's weird. That's suspicious. But nevertheless, Casey and Caylee left the house together on June 16th, 2008. And George claims that he walked Casey and Caylee out to the car that Cindy and George had kind of unofficially given to Casey. And George says he helped Caylee to get strapped into her car seat, and then he watched them drive off. And this would be the last time that Caylee was ever seen alive again. So where did they go? What did they do? And what happened? Also, I know that I keep saying that Caylee's 3, but she was actually 2 years old. But when she would last be seen alive, it was just 2 months before her 3rd birthday. So I just rounded up 2 months, that's all. Now, after George waved Casey and Caylee off, Casey's cell phone activity gives us a little bit of an insight and a little bit of an idea of where she and Caylee were during the day. And, of course, who Casey talked to throughout the day. And keep in mind that Casey told George that she was going to work and that she was dropping Caylee off with Zany the nanny before she headed into work. And what George supposedly didn't know is that Casey didn't actually have a job, even though there are many people that claim to have witnessed and heard the fight between Cindy and Casey about Casey not having a job the night before. But let's continue. So where was she going and what was she doing? We'll probably never know everything for sure, But her cell phone pings, calls, and texts do tell us a little bit of something about as far as what Casey was doing. And what it shows is that Casey didn't really go far. She made 3 calls and some other cell phone activity that showed that her phone was pinging off of the same cell phone towers that her phone would have pinged off of if she were still relatively close by her house where she lived with Cindy and George. So at 1 p.m. on June 16th, Casey placed a call to her new boo thing, Tony, and the call lasted approximately 14 or 15 minutes. Another 35 or 36-minute call was made by Casey to her friend Amy at 1:44 p.m. And then at 2:52 p.m., Casey called Jesse, and this call to Jesse was just basically Casey bitching about her life problems to him. And according to Jesse, Casey was telling him that her parents, Cindy and George, were getting a divorce. And I don't know how true that is, but regardless of the truth about a divorce that never happened, during this call with Casey, Jesse says he's almost positive that he did hear Caylee in the background of this call when he was talking to Casey. And this would kind of lead me to believe either one of 2 things is true. Either Caylee was still alive at the time of this call, or that maybe Jesse was so accustomed to hearing Caylee in the background of all the calls that he was on with Casey, that maybe he thought that he heard Caylee, but in reality she either wasn't with Casey or she was already dead. And again, we'll never know. But during this time frame, no one is ever really able to say for sure where Caylee was or even if she was still alive. So just keep that in mind because I feel like we all just kind of have to make our own assumptions with this. But between the phone pings and phone activity on Casey's phone and how closely those pings are to her house where she lived with Cindy and George, we can kind of deduce that Casey probably, most likely, allegedly, just rode around in circles and waited for George to leave for work before she returned home. Because where else is she going to go? Now, we don't know if Caylee was still with her at this time or even if Caylee was still alive at this time. Because like I keep harping on, Casey didn't actually have a job to go to, and she didn't actually drop Caylee off with a babysitter or a nanny. And aside from what everybody already assumes happened during this time, there are some internet searches that take place on the Anthony's home computer that could have only been Casey if she returned home after George had already left for work, for his real job. Because from what we know already, Cindy left work early that morning and George left for work well after Casey and Caylee left for Casey to allegedly dropped Caylee off at her fake babysitter's house to go to her job at where she didn't actually have one. So just even the fact that there were any internet searches made during the time that the house should have been empty tells me at the very least that someone was actually home, and Caylee wasn't old enough to be able to use the computer. Cindy and George are both gone to their real jobs, and that really only leaves Casey to be the one making these searches. So let's go back in my own timeline for a minute. Do you remember earlier when I said there was a slight mishap with the time frame that Caylee and Casey had supposedly left the house? The last time that Caylee was seen when Caylee told George that she was going to see Zany the nanny. Well, let's get into how this time frame doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because George is absolutely positive that Casey and Caylee left the house at 12:50 p.m. that afternoon, and that right before Caylee and Casey left, Caylee walked up to George and told him, "I'm going to see Zany." But then at 1:39 p.m., the family computer shows activity that's coming from Casey's user profile. So everyone in the family was assigned their own user profile. That way, if you were working on something or someone else got on the computer after you, they wouldn't have to be exiting out of all of your stuff or, stuff not being saved and mistakenly being deleted, whatever. This computer actually shows that someone using Casey's user profile logged into Casey's AOL AIM account. And maybe some of the younger listeners won't have any idea what I'm talking about, but an AOL AIM was just kind of like sliding into the DMs before sliding into the DMs was a thing. It was just a way to instant message other people. Everyone used it and it used to be cool. Trust me on this. So after somebody checks Casey's AIM account, they then logged into Casey's MySpace account. And MySpace was so much better than Facebook, and I'll die on this hill. But who else would be logging into all of Casey's things under her user profile? Riddle me that. After Casey's MySpace page was logged into and checked, her Facebook account was also logged into. And all of this is happening at or after 1:39 p.m. But remember, George swears that Casey and Caylee both left the house together at 12:50 p.m. So either Casey didn't leave at 12:50 p.m. like George says, or she's a magician and can be on the road and visiting a nanny and at home checking her social media accounts at the same time. So we still don't have a clear explanation on how Casey was both gone with Caylee and also at home checking AIM, MySpace, and Facebook all at the same time. Like, we never get a definitive answer on who was using the computer under Casey's user profile and correctly logging into all of her social media accounts. We can deduce that it was Casey herself, but that is allegedly. Don't sue me. At 1:42 p.m., Casey calls her best friend Amy, and the call lasts somewhere around 40 minutes or so. So after Casey makes this 40-ish minute phone call to her friend Amy, George leaves the house for work. He's working as like a security guard or something along those lines at the time, and George made it to work on time and was able to be accounted for his entire shift at work, which was from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. So it would take roughly 20 to 30 minutes for him to get to work. So that would put him leaving the house somewhere between 2:30 and 2:35. And if his shift started at 3, and if it was about a 20-ish minute drive away from his house, depending on traffic and such, he could have possibly even left the house for his shift somewhere between 2:30 and 2:40 if he was feeling risky. So, according to George, Caylee and Casey had been gone for right at 2 hours before he ever left for his shift at work, even though all of this computer activity is happening and found on Casey's user profile, while he claims she wasn't home. But anyways, after George would have already had to have been gone from the house in order to make it to work on time, which we know that he did actually make it to work on time, so he had to have been gone from the house by about 2:40 at the absolute latest in order to make it there on time. But another search happens at 2:51 p.m., and this search happens on the Anthony's home computer on the search engine Firefox.com, which is just another search engine like Google Chrome, Bing, whatever. And this search is probably the most telling out of everything that was searched. And since both Cindy and George were able to be placed at their, jobs at the time that all these searches were made, that yet again only leaves one person that could have been home and able to make these searches on the computer at the Anthony house. So that would have either had to have been Casey, or a home burglary happened that took place where nothing was stolen or misplaced, and the predator only needed to use the computer and only used it while they were logged into Casey's user profile. And I guess anything's possible. Now, this search at 2:51 that happened on the computer is the search that I was referring to earlier when I said that this search would have only been possible if Casey had returned home after George had left for work already. Now, the search that happened at 2:51 that I swear I will eventually read to you, it was made, but it wasn't even found until right before Casey Anthony's trial was already over, or right before the trial was actually over. So the jury never even heard this. So the jury never even heard about this search. And from my understanding, the search was missed because the search warrant for the Anthony's home computer only covered other search engines, like Internet Explorer or Google or, whatever. And this search was made on the Firefox search engine. And the Firefox search engine wasn't included in the search warrant for the Anthony's home computer. Because as we all know, search warrants are always super specific things. That way police can't just go crazy and go through each inch of your life. So keep in mind that this search wasn't found until it was too late. But also keep in mind that the search warrant didn't cover Firefox as a search engine in the search warrant. So the search that was made at 2:51 p.m. on June 16th read, "Foolproof suffocation." And as incriminating as it sounds, it wasn't heard in the trial. So I mean, and if George was still home at 2:51, then there is absolutely no way in hell that he would have made it to work on time. And supposedly, Casey and Caylee had been gone from the house for a while now. And Cindy was verified to already have been at work that morning. So there's just another magic trick, I guess. But I think I belong to the group of people that believe that Casey Anthony returned home after George left, since she didn't really have anywhere else to go. And also, to be fair, this search sounds awful, but if somebody was going through my search history on my phone or my computer, they would probably take me straight to jail and swear that I was a mass serial killing, murdering psychopath. So, not for nothing, but moving right along. And if I'm not mistaken, when investigators looked into Cindy and George's user profiles on this computer, it was actually found that both Cindy and George used the Internet Explorer search engine, and that Casey was the only one in the house that used Firefox.com. This is a simple detail, but I feel like it's pretty telling, because switching your normal search engine probably isn't something that you would think to do differently in a time of panic. Like, for instance, if maybe, I don't know, you just killed your toddler daughter accidentally or otherwise, you probably wouldn't think to change your search engine. That's all I'm saying. That's all. So at 2:51 p.m. on June 16th, which is the last day that Caylee was seen alive, the search about foolproof suffocation was made on Firefox engine, search website. At 2:52, somebody logs back onto Casey's Facebook, and at 2:53, Casey gets a call from her ex-boyfriend and current friend, Jesse Grund, and this call only lasts about 10 minutes or so. The two hang up, and then Casey gets a call from her dad, George, right afterwards. And this call only lasted 26 seconds, and I haven't seen a single solitary thing that says if Casey actually answered this call or if she sent her dad to voicemail. But 26 seconds is a super short amount of time for a phone call, so I'm not 100% sure if Casey and George actually talked during this call or not, or maybe if the phone just rang for 26 seconds before it was forwarded to voicemail. And all of this stuff is happening on the same day that little Caylee was last seen alive. And I feel like this is a pretty weird amount of time to spend on social media and on the phone if you haven't seen your daughter since a little after lunchtime. Which is, again, kind of alarming. Even more alarming is that Casey and Caylee had supposedly already left the house. So is there a magician in the house? Or, I don't know. At around 8 p.m. that night, Casey and her current boyfriend, Tony, are spotted on CCTV footage at their local Blockbuster. Again, for anybody that was born yesterday, Blockbuster was where you could go rent VHS tapes. You would pay to rent them and then be kind and rewind and take the bitches back. So, Tony and Casey are seen on Blockbuster CCTV footage together renting 2 movies. Tony later tells the court that Casey was pretty unbothered and she was acting pretty normally during their time together that night. He didn't notice any kind of panic or worry coming from Casey, and everything seemed pretty normal from his point of view. And Casey does look completely fine and unbothered on the video's footage from Blockbuster. But Caylee isn't with Tony and Casey that night on the footage from the Blockbuster CCTV cameras. It's only Casey and her boyfriend Tony. Caylee is not with them. Likely because at this point she had already been murdered. So I think most people assume kind of the same thing that I'm assuming here. I could be wrong, but I would be assuming that between the last time that George saw Caylee, earlier that day at 12:50, when Caylee hugged him and told him they were going to see Zanny the nanny, and then up until 8 p.m. that same night when Casey and Tony are seen at the Blockbuster, that those 2 time frames are when something happened to Caylee. In between those 2 time frames. And those time frames are believed to be the same time frames where Caylee Anthony went missing. But no one would actually find out that Caylee was missing until 31 days after this. And during those 31 days, this is also the time frame where everyone believes that Caylee was already likely killed. During those 31 days, Casey would continue about her life seemingly completely unbothered by the fact that Caylee was missing. She did not mention that she hadn't seen Caylee. She actually covers up the fact that she hasn't seen Caylee. Casey is out living her absolute best lives. She's in bars nearly every night, participating in hot body contests, being dressed sexy, and, working as a shot girl. And she's doing all of this while Caylee is missing, and nobody knows she's missing besides Casey. I feel like this is a good stopping point because there's a lot more to dig into. I'm pretty glad we got through at least the day that Caylee went missing in this episode, because next week will be where you thought Casey Anthony lied in the first two. You haven't seen shit yet. If you don't know this case, next week I'm going to literally blow your mind with the amount of lies. You are not going to believe me. You're going to go Google it because you're going to think I'm making it up. That is how outlandish it is. I'm really sorry this episode was late. It's only a day late, so please forgive me. I will make sure this doesn't happen. This isn't a normal thing. But before I say let's do it again next week, I just want to tell y'all, because some of y'all don't follow me on TikTok, which is fine. But if you want to, you definitely can at Mama Murdered a Podcast. But also, this is the end of the Casey Anthony episode. This is me just talking now. Okay, telling you my business again. A few days ago, my best friend sent me a screenshot of a post that somebody made in our town's local, what's happening in this town group on Facebook. And it said, decapitated, decomposing body found in this town behind food line. Y'all check on y'all's people. Tell me how a body is decapitated and decomposing behind our local grocery store in a town with less than 2,000 people, and they say that they don't suspect foul play. I'm sorry, law enforcement, he did not chop his own head off, sir. That is not how that works. Anyways, I thought that was crazy. I figured I would share it with y'all. So, for real, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.